The sterile white walls of the military infirmary seemed to absorb all sound, creating a bubble of silence around Commander Zekathara as he sat rigidly on the edge of his bed. His once imposing frame had withered during his long convalescence, leaving him gaunt. His pale blue skin stretched tightly over prominent bones. The scar tissue that covered half his face gave his features an asymmetrical quality that unnerved most visitors. His clouded right eye, milky white where it had once been vibrant crimson, stared unseeing at some distant point beyond the walls. 20 years, he said finally, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the small room. 20 years since the withdrawal from Terran space, and still the nightmares come. Nari shifted uncomfortably in her chair. As a junior correspondent for the Galactic News Network, this was her first major assignment, an exclusive interview with one of the few surviving high-ranking officers from the Terran campaign. The hegemony's disastrous war with the humans remained a cultural wound that had never properly healed, a subject discussed in hushed tones, if at all. "The public has a right to know what happened," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The official accounts speak of tactical withdrawals and strategic realignments. But lies," Zekathara interrupted, his good eye focusing on her with sudden intensity. "Comfortable lies we tell ourselves to preserve what remains of our pride." He flexed his prosthetic hand, the metal fingers clicking softly. "Do you know what they called it? The human soldiers? They had a name for what happened to us." Nari consulted her notes. "Terran combat syndrome?" A bitter laugh escaped the commander. "Yes, as if it were a disease rather than a revelation." He turned to look out the viewport, where the rings of Velkar Prime curved majestically against the blackness of space. The hospital station orbited at the very edge of hegemony space, as far from the core worlds as possible, while still remaining within protected territory. A place to hide the broken remnants of a failed conquest. "You must understand what we were before the war," Zekathara continued. "For 9,000 years, the hegemony expanded across the stars. We encountered dozens of sentient species, and each time, the pattern was the same. Initial resistance, followed by capitulation once our technological superiority became clear. It wasn't mere conquest. It was the natural order. We brought stability, unified law, prosperity." Nari nodded, though she knew this familiar justification was disputed by many of the integrated species. Still, there was truth in it. The hegemony had been the dominant force in the galaxy for millennia, until the humans. "We detected their radio signals for centuries before we made contact," Zekathara said. "Primitive communications, but remarkably varied. Their development was uneven, faster in some ways than expected, slower in others. When we finally established contact, they had just begun to colonize their own system, Mars, their moon, a few mining operations in their asteroid belt. We observed them for another decade before the High Council decided they were ready for integration." "And that's when the first diplomatic missions were sent," Nari prompted. "Yes. The humans seemed receptive at first, curious, eager to learn. We helped them establish their first extrasolar colonies, New Pittsburgh, New Atlantis, Kepler Station. We shared some of our simpler technologies, medical advances, improved propulsion systems, nothing that would upset the balance of power, of course. But relations deteriorated." Zekathara's expression darkened. "The humans became resistant to guidance. They began to develop technologies along unauthorized paths. They refused cultural assimilation programs. When the Council attempted to establish proper governance structures on their colonies, there were protests, then riots." He paused. "We had seen such reactions before. A phase of adjustment. We thought it would pass. But it didn't." "No." The commander's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Instead, it escalated. The council ordered a military presence to maintain order. Routine procedure. I was given command of the 16th Fleet, tasked with securing the new Pittsburgh colony. A simple operation. A show of force. Nothing more. His breathing quickened. We had no idea what we were walking into. Nari leaned forward, activating her recording device. Its soft blue light cast eerie shadows across the commander's scarred face. "Tell me about New Pittsburgh," she said. Zekathara closed his eye for a long moment, and when he opened it again, Nari could see he was no longer present in the room with her. He was back there, 20 years ago, reliving horrors that had never left him. "We lost our first convoy 3 days after establishing orbit," he began. 12 transport vessels carrying troops and equipment to the surface. They simply vanished. No distress signals, no debris field. Just gone. His prosthetic hand clenched into a fist. It made no sense. Human technology couldn't possibly have overcome our shields or detection systems. What happened? We sent search parties. Found nothing. Increased security protocols. Began landing troops in smaller groups, under heavy escort. Established a forward operating base outside the main settlement. He swallowed hard. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. No resistance. No contact with the colonists. The mining facilities were abandoned. Homes empty. We thought they had fled to the wilderness. But they hadn't. No. They were watching us, learning our patterns. Waiting. Zekathara's voice grew distant. On the 17th day, at precisely 0300 hours, every power system in our base failed simultaneously. Backup generators, emergency lighting, communication arrays, all dead. We later discovered that a woman named Lisa Murphy, a power plant engineer, had built microscopic sabotage devices into the very components we were using. Components her company had been manufacturing for us for years. Nari made a note. A civilian? Yes, that was the first revelation. In all our prior conflicts, we faced military forces, organized resistance with clear chains of command, identifiable targets, but the humans. He shook his head. Every civilian was a potential combatant. The barista serving drinks to our officers was memorizing their conversations. The maintenance worker was mapping our patrol routes. The doctor treating our wounded was collecting data on our physiology. "Dr. Susan Hayes," Nari said, consulting her notes. Zekathara's face contorted. "Yes, Hayes. She appeared to be cooperating fully. Established a medical exchange program. Treated our injured with apparent compassion. We didn't realize until much later that she was developing targeted biological agents the entire time. Substances that would affect our neurochemistry but leave humans untouched. What did these agents do? Induced paranoia, hallucinations, created a sense of being watched, even in empty rooms. Not lethal, but insidious." The commander's gaze drifted to the ceiling. After the power failure, the attacks began. Not frontal assaults. We could have handled those. Instead, a mining engineer named Jake Williams had adapted their excavation explosives into devices that could be triggered remotely or by pressure plates. Our troops would be on patrol, and suddenly, the ground would disappear beneath them. Buildings we had secured would collapse without warning. Water systems would become contaminated. "Guerrilla tactics," Nari suggested. "No," Zekathara corrected sharply. "Guerrilla warfare implies military operatives behind enemy lines. These were ordinary people, teachers, farmers, shop owners. They had transformed their entire society into a weapon against us." He fell silent for a moment. "After 3 months, we abandoned New Pittsburgh. Officially, it was described as a strategic repositioning. In reality, we had lost nearly 40% of our forces, without ever engaging in what we would consider a proper battle. The lights in the infirmary flickered briefly, and Zekathara flinched, his hand reaching instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. Nari waited patiently for him to regain his composure. The High Command believed New Pittsburgh was an anomaly, he continued eventually. They ordered a larger force to secure New Atlantis, the ocean colony on Proxima Centauri b. 10,000 troops, state-of-the-art equipment, overwhelming air superiority. General Korax was confident it would be a swift operation. But it wasn't. No. Zekathara's voice broke slightly. New Atlantis was worse, much worse. The vast ocean of Proxima Centauri b stretched to the horizon, its surface glittering under the red dwarf sun. New Atlantis consisted of hundreds of floating platforms, interconnected by flexible bridges, with additional structures extending into the depths. From orbit, it resembled a massive, geometric sea creature sprawled across the water. We established air dominance immediately, Zekathara recalled. Our craft patrolled constantly, monitoring all movement on the surface. The humans appeared to offer no resistance. Many fled to the underwater habitats. But we controlled all access points. General Korax established his command center on the central platform and began systematic security sweeps. For the first month, we encountered only passive resistance. Doors locked from the inside, corrupted data systems, occasional sabotage. Nothing we couldn't handle. But then, he paused, his breathing becoming labored. Then the ocean itself seemed to turn against us. How do you mean? Nari asked. It began with the disappearance of patrol boats. We used small watercraft to monitor the channels between platforms. They began to vanish, first one or two, then dozens. No distress calls, no signs of combat. Our sensors detected nothing beneath the waves. Zekathara's good eye had taken on a haunted look. General Korax ordered submersible drones to investigate. The footage they sent back showed nothing. Empty water. But the drones disappeared too, one by one. Some of the last transmissions included strange audio, clicks and whistles that seemed almost like a language, but nothing our translators could decipher. The humans had trained marine life, Nari suggested. That was our assumption initially. The planet had indigenous aquatic species, nothing sentient, but some were large predators. We thought perhaps the humans had found a way to direct them against our forces. The commander shook his head. We were wrong. What was it? Human divers. They had developed stealth suits that masked their heat signatures and absorbed our sonar pulses. They could remain submerged for hours, using modified breathing apparatus. They moved in small teams, attaching magnetic explosive devices to our vessels, disabling our equipment, severing communication cables between platforms. Nari frowned. But surely you could have detected them eventually. We did. We adjusted our sensors, established new security protocols. That's when they changed tactics. Zekathara's voice dropped lower. They began psychological operations. They would tap on the hulls of our ships at night, patterns that started and stopped randomly. They would leave handprints on viewport windows 20 levels below the surface. They arranged the debris of our destroyed equipment on the ocean floor to form symbols visible only from specific angles. To what purpose? Fear. The word hung in the air between them. Pure, irrational fear. Our troops began to dread water assignments. Some refused to patrol at night. Others reported hearing voices calling their names from the depths. Sleep deprivation became widespread. Hallucinations. We lost as many soldiers to suicide as to direct human action. The medical monitor, beside Zekathara's bed, began to beep more rapidly, registering his elevated heart rate. He took several deep breaths before continuing. Then came the attack on the command cruiser. His voice was flat now, emotionless, as if distancing himself from the memory. General Korax had maintained his headquarters aboard the Indomitable, keeping it stationary above the central platform. It was our most heavily defended position, with concentric rings of defensive systems and constant surveillance. No human craft could have approached undetected. They didn't need to approach, he continued after a moment. They had already infiltrated. A maintenance team that had serviced the environmental systems 2 weeks earlier had left behind devices throughout the ship, not explosives, but specially designed acoustic projectors. At precisely midnight, they activated. What did they do? They emitted sounds. Terrible sounds. Frequencies that resonated with our auditory physiology, creating unbearable pain. Patterns that triggered primitive fear responses in our brains. The entire crew was incapacitated within minutes. By the time our relief forces arrived, the humans had boarded the vessel, downloaded our complete tactical database, and vanished back into the ocean. Zekathara's hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water. The Indomitable was abandoned after that. No one would serve aboard her. The troops claimed they could still hear the sounds in certain sections, though our instruments detected nothing. 3 days later, a massive underwater explosion destroyed the central support tethers of New Atlantis. The entire colony began to break apart, platforms colliding in the rough seas. We had no choice but to evacuate. Another defeat, Nari said softly. Another lesson we failed to learn, Zekathara corrected. The High Command still believed these were isolated incidents, not a pattern. They remained convinced that a sufficiently overwhelming force would succeed where our previous attempts had failed. They turned their attention to Kepler Station. The commander's face contorted with what might have been pain. If New Pittsburgh was a surprise and New Atlantis a nightmare, then Kepler Station was. He couldn't finish the sentence. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft beeping of the medical equipment and Zekathara's ragged breathing. Nari waited, sensing they were approaching the heart of his trauma. Kepler Station, he finally continued, was the humans' first deep space habitat. A marvel of engineering. A rotating wheel nearly 5 kilometers in diameter, with habitation zones, research facilities, manufacturing sectors, and extensive docking arrays, home to over 50,000 colonists. Our intelligence suggested it was also their primary military research installation. The High Command authorized our largest task force yet, 20 capital ships, 40,000 troops, the most advanced weapons in our arsenal. No more measured responses. No more attempts at minimal force. This would be a decisive strike to break the human's will to resist. Nari noted the bitterness in his voice. You disagreed with this approach? I advised caution. The humans had already demonstrated their ingenuity twice, but I was overruled. Colonel Foster was given command of the operation, and I was assigned as his second. Zekathara's eye narrowed. Foster was a traditionalist. He believed in overwhelming force, decisive battles. He had no patience for what he called primitive trickery. The initial assault went according to plan. We established a blockade, disabled their long-range communications, and demanded surrender. When they refused, we began precision strikes against their defensive systems. Within hours, their outer defenses were crippled. Foster ordered boarding parties to secure the docking bays. The commander's breathing had become shallow. The resistance was minimal, too minimal. I warned Foster that something was wrong, but he was eager to report a victory. He led the main force into the station, while I remained in command of our fleet. For 6 hours, our troops advanced through the station, encountering only sporadic resistance. Foster reported that many sections appeared to have been hastily abandoned, with personal belongings left behind. They reached the central hub, where the station's command center was located. Still no significant opposition. Then Foster himself located Admiral Morrison, the human commander of the station. He was alone in the control room, apparently waiting for us. According to the transcript, his first words were, I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it. Nari leaned forward. A trap? Yes, but not the kind we expected. Zekathara closed his eye. Morrison had evacuated the civilian population days earlier, using small craft that slipped past our long-range sensors. Those who remained were all military personnel who had volunteered for what they called a delay action. Their sole purpose was to keep us occupied, to draw as many of our forces onto the station as possible. While Foster was taking Morrison into custody, our sensors detected energy fluctuations in the station's reactor core. Foster ordered immediate investigation, but the access ways to the engineering section were suddenly sealed. Morrison just smiled and said, "It's too late. The reaction is already beyond containment." Zekathara's voice had become a whisper. Foster ordered immediate evacuation, but Morrison had locked down the docking systems. Our troops were trapped. I ordered rescue operations from our fleet vessels, but we could only extract a small percentage of our forces before... He fell silent, staring at something only he could see. "The station exploded?" Nari prompted gently. "No." Zekathara shook his head slowly. "That would have been cleaner." What Morrison had done was far more calculated. The reactor hadn't been set to explode. It had been modified to create a specific type of radiation pulse, one that would be particularly devastating to our neurological systems, while leaving human physiology relatively unharmed. As the radiation spread through the station, our troops began to experience seizures, hallucinations, paralysis. The humans, protected by countermeasures they had prepared, were able to move freely among our incapacitated forces. They didn't kill the helpless. That would have been a mercy. Instead, they administered compounds that ensured survival, but preserved the neurological damage. "You mean they deliberately created disabled veterans?" Nari asked, horrified. "Yes, thousands of them. Warriors who would return home with minds permanently altered, requiring constant care, serving as living reminders of human ingenuity." Zekathara's voice was hollow. Morrison sacrificed himself and his volunteers to inflict a wound that would never fully heal, not just to our military capability, but to our cultural psyche. I managed to extract approximately 30% of our forces before the station's life support systems failed completely. Foster was among the casualties. The High Command classified the entire incident and distributed a cover story about a reactor accident. The truth was too damaging to morale. The medical monitor beside the bed began to emit a warning tone. A medical droid glided into the room, administered a sedative, and departed without a word. Zekathara's breathing gradually steadied. "I should rest," he said, though he made no move to lie down. "We can continue tomorrow." "Of course." Nari began to gather her equipment. "No," he said suddenly. "No. I need to finish this. While I still have the courage." His gaze was intense, almost feverish. "You need to hear about Kepler 442b, about the tunnels." Nari slowly settled back into her chair and reactivated her recorder. "After Kepler Station," Zekathara continued, "the High Command was divided. Some advocated for withdrawal from human space, arguing that the cost of subjugation was too high. Others insisted that a full-scale planetary assault was the only answer. No more limited engagements. No more precision strikes. Overwhelming force against their homeworld and major colonies. But Earth was heavily defended. Yes. Their home system was a fortress by then. So the compromise was to target Kepler 442b, their most developed extrasolar colony, with nearly 1 million inhabitants. A temperate world, Earth-like but with higher mountain ranges and stronger gravity. If we could break them there, the theory went, the rest of their colonies would capitulate. Zekathara's expression had become distant again. The assault force was massive, 100 capital ships, over 200,000 troops, enough firepower to reduce the entire surface to ash. But the High Command had learned some caution from our previous encounters. We began with orbital bombardment, targeting all major infrastructure, destroying anything that might conceivably serve a military purpose. For 3 weeks, we pummeled the surface. Cities were leveled, transportation networks severed, power grids destroyed. Our sensors showed the human population retreating to the mountain ranges, presumably seeking shelter in natural cave systems. When the bombardment was complete, the Supreme Commander authorized the ground invasion. I led the first wave personally. We established landing zones in the Central Plains, away from the mountains where the humans had taken refuge. No resistance was encountered during the landing. Our forward scouts reported no defensive positions, no signs of organized military presence. It appeared the bombardment had broken their will to fight. Zekathara's voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if he were reading from a report rather than recounting personal experience. We advanced toward the mountain ranges in force. Our geological surveys had identified the major cave entrances, and we planned to force the humans out through a combination of gas attacks and focused sonic weapons, non-lethal methods designed to minimize civilian casualties while compelling surrender. The first cave complex we approached appeared abandoned. Sensors detected human life signs deeper within the mountain, but no defensive positions at the entrance. I ordered a company to secure the outer chambers, while the main force prepared the gas dispensers. The commander's breathing had quickened again. They encountered no resistance as they advanced. The tunnels were clearly artificial, too regular, too smooth. They had been prepared in advance. Some of the troops reported unease at how easily they were progressing, but the company commander pressed on, following the life sign readings. 2 kilometers into the mountain, they encountered the first junction, a large chamber with 5 identical tunnels leading off in different directions. The life signs appeared to be coming from the central passage. The company commander divided his forces, sending a platoon down each tunnel while maintaining communication through our encrypted network. Zekathara swallowed hard. 20 minutes later, all communication ceased. I ordered an immediate rescue operation. 2 more companies entered the tunnel system, advancing with extreme caution. They found no signs of combat in the first sections, no weapon discharges, no blood, no bodies, just empty tunnels. At the first junction, they discovered strange markings on the walls that hadn't been reported by the first company, symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly, creating disorientation. The rescue force split up as the first had done, proceeding down each tunnel. Only one group returned. The commander's voice had dropped to a whisper. They reported that their tunnel had abruptly sealed behind them, followed by a localized gravity reversal. The troops found themselves falling back toward the entrance, unable to maintain their position. The other groups experienced different phenomena. Some tunnels flooded with a gas that induced violent hallucinations. Others contained sonic weapons tuned to frequencies that targeted our neural patterns. One simply collapsed, burying an entire platoon alive. The humans had created a labyrinth specifically designed to fragment our forces and target our psychological vulnerabilities. Each tunnel system contained different traps, different horrors. Some were technological, others purely psychological. Passages that looped back on themselves impossibly. Chambers where the walls appeared to breathe. Sections where our communications would play back to us with subtle, disturbing alterations. Nari's recording device flickered momentarily. She tapped it to ensure it was still functioning properly. We lost over 40,000 troops in the first day, Zekathara continued. Not to conventional combat, but to the tunnels themselves. Those who managed to return were often changed, unable to articulate what they had experienced. Some had attacked their own squadmates in panic or confusion. I ordered a general withdrawal to the surface, intending to resume orbital bombardment. But during our retreat, the humans finally emerged from hiding. Not from the tunnels we had been exploring, but from thousands of smaller openings that our surveys hadn't detected. They attacked our disorganized forces as we attempted to reach our landing craft. They were led by a man named Ben Carter, a civilian architect who had apparently spent years designing the tunnel systems specifically to combat our invasion. Each chamber, each passage had been crafted with knowledge of our psychology, our tactical doctrines, our sensory capabilities. It was a three-dimensional trap on a scale we had never imagined possible. We managed to evacuate less than half our landing force. Those who couldn't reach the transports established defensive positions on the surface, preparing for a prolonged engagement. But the humans didn't press their advantage. They retreated back into their tunnels, emerging only for night raids that kept our troops in a constant state of exhaustion and fear. Zekathara's prosthetic hand opened and closed rhythmically. For 3 months, we maintained our positions, unable to advance, unwilling to withdraw completely. The High Command insisted we could still prevail through superior firepower and numbers. But with each passing day, morale deteriorated further. The tunnels were always there, dark entrances visible from our camps. Troops began to report hearing voices calling to them from the openings. Some would wake screaming from nightmares. Others simply walked into the darkness and never returned. And then came the attacks on our homeworlds. Nari looked up sharply. Attacks? On Hegemony space? Yes. Zekathara's face was grim. While we were focused on Kepler 442b, human commando teams had somehow penetrated our borders. They didn't target military installations or government centers. Instead, they struck at cultural sites, financial hubs, transportation networks, not to destroy them, but to demonstrate that they could reach them at will. One team infiltrated the Grand Archive on Velkar Prime, our most sacred repository of knowledge. They didn't damage anything. They simply left human artifacts intermingled with our most ancient texts. Another team briefly hijacked the central banking transmission, inserting cryptic human phrases into financial data streams that caused momentary panic in our markets. These weren't military victories in any traditional sense. They were psychological operations designed to create a sense of vulnerability at the heart of our civilization. No Hegemony citizen had ever feared an alien presence on our core worlds. Suddenly, humans seemed to be able to appear anywhere, strike at our most secure locations, then vanish without a trace. The economic impact was immediate. Markets collapsed as confidence eroded. Cultural activities were abandoned as citizens retreated to the safety of their homes. The most basic foundation of Hegemony society, absolute security within our borders, had been shattered. Zekathara shifted on his bed, wincing slightly. The Supreme Commander recalled our forces from Kepler 442b 4 days after the Archive incident. The official explanation was strategic redeployment to address emerging threats. The reality was a complete military and psychological defeat, unlike anything in our 9,000-year history. Nari made notes as he spoke, her expression troubled. And that led to the peace negotiations? Yes, though negotiations implies a degree of parity that didn't exist. Zekathara's tone was bitter. We expected the humans to press their advantage, to demand reparations, territorial concessions, technology transfers. What we didn't expect was Secretary Helen Ross. She was their chief negotiator, correct? She was. The commander seemed to search for the right words. She was the perfect weapon for that particular battlefield. Elderly by human standards, perhaps 70 years old, small in stature, physically unimposing. She arrived at the neutral station alone, without advisors or security. Our negotiating team was composed of our most experienced diplomats, legal experts, military strategists. They arrived with comprehensive demands, prepared to bargain from a position of perceived strength despite our recent setbacks. Zekathara gave a small, humorless laugh. Ross listened to our opening position in silence. When our chief diplomat finished speaking, she simply said, "No." Not angrily, not disrespectfully, just a calm, firm negative. She then presented the human terms: immediate withdrawal from all human colonies, recognition of human sovereignty over their existing territories and any they might claim in the future, and a buffer zone extending 5 light-years beyond their current frontier. Our negotiators attempted to counter with a more balanced proposal. Ross just shook her head and said, "You misunderstand the situation. These are not negotiable points. They are the conditions under which humanity will refrain from demonstrating our full capabilities." When pressed on what those capabilities might be, she refused to elaborate, saying only, "You've seen enough to draw your own conclusions. We prefer not to speak of what remains unused." The implication was clear. What we had experienced was merely a fraction of human military potential. Whether this was true or a masterful bluff, we couldn't determine. Our intelligence had failed us repeatedly throughout the conflict. The possibility that they possessed even more devastating weapons or tactics was convincing. Zekathara's good eye fixed on Nari. The Treaty of Proxima Centauri was signed 3 days later. We withdrew from human space within a month. The buffer zone was established and has remained in place for 2 decades. Limited cultural and scientific exchanges were permitted, but no military presence on either side. "And the Terran Combat Syndrome?" Nari asked. "When did that term emerge?" "Almost immediately after our return." The commander's voice had grown tired. Thousands of veterans experienced similar symptoms: paranoia, nightmares, hallucinations centered on human tactics, and psychological warfare. Some couldn't bear to enter enclosed spaces, remembering the tunnels. Others developed hydrophobia after New Atlantis. Many reported hearing human voices whispering to them in the empty rooms. Our medical authorities classified it as a form of post-traumatic stress. But it was more than that. It was a fundamental rewiring of our understanding of warfare, of what was possible, of what could be feared. Zekathara gestured to his scarred face. "These wounds healed years ago, but the others, the memories, the knowledge of our vulnerability, those never heal." "Do you think the humans will expand into the buffer zone eventually?" Nari asked. "No." The commander's response was immediate. "They have no need to provoke us further. They've continued to develop their own territories, their own technologies. Occasional diplomatic contacts suggest they've moved beyond the conflict in ways we haven't been able to." He sighed deeply. The true victory for the humans wasn't military. It was forcing us to confront the limitations of our understanding. For 9,000 years, we believed we comprehended the nature of intelligent species, of conquest, of resistance. We had categorized all possible responses to our expansion. The humans showed us how narrow our vision had been. Their greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their adaptability, their willingness to transform their entire society into a defense mechanism, to make every civilian a potential combatant, every habitat a potential trap. They understood us better than we understood ourselves, and they used that knowledge with surgical precision. Zekathara's eye drifted closed. That's the core of Terran Combat Syndrome, not the trauma of defeat, but the fundamental uncertainty it created. If we were wrong about humanity, what else might we be wrong about? What other assumptions might prove fatal? The medical monitor began to signal again, more insistently this time. Nari knew their time was drawing to a close. "Commander," she said softly, "why have you chosen to speak now, after 20 years of silence?" Zekathara opened his eyes slowly. "Because the silence hasn't healed anything. Because the official histories are still filled with euphemisms and omissions. Because those who don't understand the true nature of humanity may someday advocate for renewed conflict. He paused. And because testimony is the only catharsis available to me. The medical droid returned, adjusting the commander's medication without comment. Zekathara's breathing eased, and his tense posture began to relax as the sedatives took effect. "Will your network publish the full account?" he asked, his voice beginning to slur slightly. "Yes," Nari promised. "Unedited and without commentary." "Good." His eye was growing unfocused. "They should know. All of them should know what waits beyond the buffer zone. Not monsters. Not villains. Just humans. Ordinary humans. The most terrifying force we have ever encountered." As the commander drifted into sedated sleep, Nari gathered her equipment with trembling hands. She had come seeking a story of military tactics and strategic decisions. Instead, she had been given a chronicle of psychological warfare that had broken not just an invasion force, but the spirit of a 9,000-year-old empire. She paused at the door, looking back at the scarred veteran. The official account would be published as promised, but she knew it would cause controversy throughout hegemony space. Some would dismiss it as the ramblings of a traumatized soldier. Others would demand renewed military buildup, arguing that 20 years was long enough to prepare for a second attempt. Few would grasp the deeper truth that Zekathara had tried to convey, that the hegemony had not merely lost a war, but had encountered a species so fundamentally different in its approach to conflict that traditional concepts of victory and defeat were inadequate. As Nari stepped into the corridor, she found herself glancing anxiously at the shadows, half expecting to find human commandos lurking in the darkness. The buffer zone had held for 2 decades, but Zekathara's account made clear that if humanity ever chose to cross it, no defense could be truly adequate. 20 years of peace had not been enough to heal the wounds of the Terran War. Perhaps nothing ever would be.